All right, so welcome to SLiTHER number 39. Chip jumped ahead of the schedule to make some way for Joanne for SLiTHER 40. So we appreciate Chip taking one for the team. Chip's going to talk about LO discussions and structuring those in his senior level inorganic course. I'm Matt Cranswick. I'm at Oregon State University at Tommy, which is something else completely different. But I'll be your host today. If you have any questions, I'm sure Chip won't mind if you interrupt him. And if you're too shy and want me to ask, just drop it in the chat and I'll bother Chip about it. After the presentation, I'll be asking or I'll be sending out a review so you can tell us all how badly Chip did. And if you'll keep yourself muted so that, barking dogs, meowing cats, or crying undergraduates are not picked up in the background, we appreciate that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chip.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. Thanks, everyone, for popping in. And I assure you, you're the ones taking one for the team by being here, but hopefully we'll have some good conversation about something I say that stirs things up. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some learning object development and structure of a course. And I would say one kind of followed the other. It was probably more having a rough outline of the course first and then developing learning objects in that. So to give you a little bit of kind of context, the course I'm focusing on here today is my senior level inorganic course. So it's the second inorganic course BS chemistry majors take here at Lafayette. I also get some biochemistry majors that do take it. Typically, it's not a big course. I have 7 this fall, and that's probably about my long-term average. So it's a nice, small, manageable group overall. The course, I can be whatever I want it to be. I want it to be very organometallic-y in nature, but with some group theory splashed in and related to it. We meet 4 times a week for 50 minutes over 14 weeks. That's a total of 56 classes. 8 of those classes I set aside for going over assigned problem sets. So, students get the problem sets. They get about a week to work on them, and then we discuss them in class. Grade-wise, it's pretty much, did you put forth any effort or not in doing them? I set aside 8 classes for literature discussions, and that's what we'll be talking about here today. And then 3 classes for exams with a final scheduled outside the normal 14-week period by the registrar. So this is available on Viper. My syllabus for the course is there, so you can check it out. But just again, to give us a little context, you can take a quick peek at what we cover. If you look over in the assignment column, and I'm sorry, it's tiny. I have this thing with liking figures to fit in certain spaces on slides. Anything that's LD is a literature discussion. So you can see they come about every week and a half, 2 weeks. And I try and get in 2 per exam block unit.
Chip, really quickly, what textbook are you using?
I am using George Stanley's book, which is on Viper, so a freebie. And I do supplement that with the LibreText that I created for my first inorganic course, which has some of the group theory components in there. So anything labeled here in my chapter/section, chapter 1, anything chap is the Stanley book on Viper, and anything labeled IC is my LibreText. Which again pretty much is the group theory, which I introduce in my inorganic 1 course and then go into more detail in this course.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Good question. I should have thought about saying something about that there. Okay, so let's jump into the literature discussions that I use in my course and where they came from. So this is the first literature discussion that I use in my course, ligand effects in titration calorimetry from the Angelisi lab. This was created for our Michigan workshop more years ago than I want to admit. Of course, it's got a focus on different ligands. In particular, a lot of differences in CP versus CP star ligands, different phosphines and hydrides. And just to be upfront about it, I worked with Bob as a grad student. This is not a paper of mine, but it was someone I was in the group with at the time. So I was very familiar with the work. And that was part of the motivation to create it. But I also thought there's just a lot of cool foundational stuff in it that would make sort of a great first LO and lit discussion to talk about in class. Now, the paper is by student standards long. I think it's 8, maybe 10 pages. But I did develop a reading guide for this particular paper, and this is all on Viper, where essentially it just points to students to like read this paragraph, look at this data point, read this table. So they really don't have to read the entire paper to get the nuggets out of it that I want them to get. Of course, the major focus and where this fits in well with my course is carbonyls. So the compound study in this particular paper are monocarbonyls, which makes interpreting the IR spectra pretty easy. There's only one CO band in them, which is nice. But we can look at the effect of changing the phosphine. What happens is you get a more electron donating phosphine. Where does the CO band shift to overall? So really nice to do that with, and it fits right in. Carbonyls are one of the first ligands I introduce. Also, the effect of changing CP versus CP star. CP star is more electron donating. What happens to the carbonyl when the only change is CP versus CP star? So really nice kind of subtle things. Also do electron counting. We're going to see that's something that happens in pretty much every L I do, just always going back to that. But in this particular paper, it's really nice because it's a study of protonation and methylation of the particular metal compounds. So by doing electron counting, we're able to talk about my idea of state functions of counting. If you're familiar with the CBC method, this will make sense. If you're not, drop me a line. We'll chat about it more. Formally, you're adding, say, a proton to a metal complex. In reality, you're adding a Z. You're adding something with no electrons. But in counting, we don't count it as a Z. We don't count it as something with no electrons. So we talk about here's the before, here's the after. How we get from point A to point B doesn't matter. It's just the overall counting. And kind of the fun thing is we get to see the idea of oxidative addition without actually introducing the name. I do that later in the course. But we look at going from iridium 1 to iridium 3 and looking at the carbonyls and how big a shift there is in the vibrational frequency as the metal is oxidized. So it just fits in really well with what we're doing at that particular point in time. The second lit discussion that I do, assuming this will advance any further, is on group 6 metal carbonyl compounds with pincer ligands. So we introduce a new type of ligand. We talk about pincer ligands, tridentates, meridional geometry, that kind of good stuff. But once again, this has more carbonyls. Again, that's the major focus in my first kind of unit, where we're talking about ligands, but then I also get into group theory and applications of group theory. So we do a little more counting, again, rehashing that in every literature discussion. But in this one, I'm able to introduce group theory. We look at a couple of different isomers in particular, even though the paper doesn't necessarily cover the mer and FAC isomers of chromium tricarbonyl triacetonitrile, I have them do the, hey, what if you get the FAC and mer isomers? How many different bands would you expect to see in these two compounds? Kind of thing. So it's a really good fit for us in this first section. We look at trends in metals, and like most things, we discover the 4D is unique. So we get to talk about that. And then we move on to the third literature discussion. Actually did this one this week. We've been talking about pi systems. So this is a neat little paper on ethylene compounds of the coinage metals. And as I said, I did this on Monday. It fit in perfectly with what I had been covering in class. We had just talked a little bit about fluxional behavior and different kinds of NMR techniques related to pi systems. This paper has some really, really cool NMR stuff in it. It also introduces one of those ligands that in the CBC method just, I'll admit, makes me cringe a tiny little bit, and that's the tris-paraxylyl borate ligand. It's a weird count. If you're familiar with TP at all, it's a CP analog. To get it to come out to be a CP analog in covalent bond classification, it's a little weaselly, but it does work. You can get it there, but students do scuffle with that one a little bit, so we always have a little conversation about that one. There's great links in this paper between X-ray data and NMR. In terms of, in particular, it's how strongly the ethylene binds to the coinage metals. We can look at X-ray data, carbon-carbon bond lengths. We can look at NMR shifts and see just how shifted the ethylene protons are compared to free ethylene. So I think that's really beautiful stuff and fun to do. There's NMR presented in the SI, and the NMR is just really, really cool. These compounds, they're essentially TP coinage metal ethylene compounds. The gold binds ethylene incredibly strong. So when you do the NMR under an atmosphere of ethylene, you see free ethylene and coordinated ethylene. The silver and copper compounds bind the ethylene much less strong. So with silver, there's a really fast exchange between free ethylene and coordinated. So you see one nice sharp peak in the proton NMR. And with the copper, it's a bit slower. So it's sort of a broad hump. So we dig into the SI and look at those spectra, which are really, really cool. It's a short paper. It's, I think, from after that first one, we get down to 3-4 page papers, so that the students appreciate that and do actually take the time to read it. The fourth literature discussion is coming up next week. I'm a little worried about the timing on this because we haven't really talked about catalysis or reaction mechanisms too much, but we don't need it for this paper. It's a lot of looking at the data and looking for trends. The cool thing is the ligands have ferrocene in it, near and dear to my heart. So it's taken me, four papers to have something with ferrocene in it. That's kind of shocking. It's got electrochemistry in it, also something near and dear to my heart. And again, took 4 papers to get that in, but that's okay. So we get to talk a little bit about that technique and what we can learn from it. Which is a little beyond what I would normally cover in the course, but that's a good thing. Again, it wouldn't be one of my lit discussions without some electron counting and group theory associated with it. We start breaking into catalysis a little bit, which is good. That's going to be a major topic in the second half of the course. So getting them geared up to think about that. So there's really nothing new except for like CV in this lit discussion. But it's kind of synthesizing some ideas about what we've talked up to in this point, getting us set up for the next section. And this, I'd love to say I'd planned it ahead or I knew something that no one else knew, but it's not going to hurt that I'll be able to sell this as, oh yeah, by the way, this type of chemistry might have just, gotten a Nobel or something along those lines. So that should be a fun part of our discussion. Our fifth literature discussion, I really like this one. This is, I taught the Monsanto acetic acid process for years. It's in pretty much any book. And then eventually I just got the idea of like, why am I teaching this? Why don't we just look at the original paper? It's a short communication in JAX. And it's just beautiful. It's old school. It does let me work in a little conversation related to DEIJ issues, because as one of those communications from the 1970s, it starts with "Dear Sir." So we get to talk about that, and which is interesting. One very, very tiny sign of progress that doesn't happen anymore. It's really short. Students love it. Some of the figures are, by today's standards, very rough. So there's always comments on, ooh, this was so hard to visualize. It was such a bad figure, but that's okay. It's great that students can discover it. And, by this point in the class, they can chomp through this paper without any problem. And so much better for them to discover and figure out what's going on than for me to just lecture at them. Of course, my LO has electron counting as part of it, some group theory in it, and it's got some very simple reactions and mechanisms that we've talked about, but now we're starting to tie it together in catalysis. And that's what we're going to be building on in class from this point out. So they're able to handle insertion reactions, which is the major thing that's going on in this process, as well as oxidative addition, reductive elimination. So they're able to start building out, okay, so this mechanism term that maybe we're scared of from orgo really isn't that bad. We're just kind of doing and undoing the same reactions. The sixth lit discussion, moving on, this is some chemistry that I just love. It's from Paula Diaconescu's lab. So it's got some ferrocene in it. But this is really, really cool stuff. She's able to turn on and off a polymerization catalyst just based on the oxidation state of her ferrocene-based ligand. So we hit electron counting, redox chemistry, catalysis. This also has some very, very simple Zanes in it, and that's not my comfort zone at all. So it's not something I'd really put in my class normally, but the stuff in Paula's paper is like, just here's the technique and here's what it tells us. She lays it out beautiful, again, in a very, very short paper, just like, look at the picture, here's what it's telling us, boom. And students are able to grasp that. I do have them look up exactly what Zanes means and what we learned from the technique as part of their pre-class assignment. But I think it's a nice little introduction to a complex technique. All right, my seventh lit discussion. This is a brand new one. Eventually, it's going to get published on Viper, but it is new, so I'm a little worried how it's going to work. I don't know yet. I'm going to find out. But this is one that was inspired by this past summer's organometallic Gordon Research Conference. The idea of hydrodefluorination came up an awful lot. And if you're familiar with, fluorinated stuff, we've gotten quite good at putting fluorines on things, from Teflon to many drugs have fluorines on them. And part of the reason we like having fluorines on them is because they last forever. And now we're discovering that there's a problem with fluorines lasting forever. So what can we do to defluorinate things? It was a big topic at the conference. So I thought it was really important, if it's big in the field, we should be talking about it. So in this case, it was more of I had a very, very targeted topic I wanted to talk about, go out into the literature, dig around, and find a paper that I thought students could handle that covered that topic. Again, I introduced things that are not at all part of the paper, but are significant in the background. And that's something I emphasize with students all along as I go. Like, remember, these papers are written for experts in the field. There's a lot of assumed knowledge. You have that knowledge now. They're not going to lay it out for you, but you want to be thinking about things like electron counts. It presents a nice mechanism for students to think about, talk about. Again, something that by the time we get to this one, they're going to be able to handle and know what reactions are being mentioned and being proposed. So I'm looking forward to that aspect of it. And then again, the final lit discussion this semester, the hydrogenative depolymerization of nylons. Again, this one is new, so I'm going to be nervous going into it, exactly how well students deal with it. Again, this comes out of this past summer's organometallic GRC. I would say even more so than defluorination was the idea of depolymerization, which, I don't have quite the history, but I imagine when the Organometallic Gordon Research Conference started, we were at the other end of the spectrum. Everyone was talking about polymerizing olefins. Well, as we've discovered now, great, we can make a ton of plastic. It gets thrown out and it lasts forever in the environment. What can we do to reuse those polymers? Mechanical recycling of plastics is really not that good. The material you get back just isn't as good as the starting material. So if we had a way to break plastics down into monomers and then use those to repolymerize, it would be much better. So there are a lot of talks on this subject. And again, it really motivated me. I got to get something about this that students can handle into my class. So again, very targeted, looking for a topic in the literature. Again, surprise, electron counting is part of it. Mostly this paper is data interpretation. So there's not too much presented in the way of mechanisms. Dirty little secret, it's from an organic journal. They're not too focused on developing the catalyst or looking at the metal aspects, big O, little m on this paper. But I think the data interpretation is cool. It's different solvents, different conditions, good things for students to be, thinking about of how a catalytic system is developed. So that's my quick little rundown on the literature discussions that I use in my class. Again, the first 6 are on Viper. The last 2 have been submitted and will hopefully be reviewed at some point in the very near future and be available for everyone to take a peek at. Happily take any questions, comments, ideas, things people want to talk about related to that. And I'll turn it back over to Matt and stop sharing for now. Maybe.
All right. Thank you, Chip. Let's see. I don't know what's going on with my screen right now. So I wanted to let everybody know the CVC method that Chip was talking about. That is SLiTHEr number 30. You can find that on our YouTube channel. And then the LOs that he included, I'll link those to the LO web app on the Ionic Viper site also. I have a
self-referencing. Good job, Matt.
Yeah, I'm trying to help you out here, Chip. So I have a question before we open it up. And for me, LO discussions in the past were always really difficult. So my question to you is, what does a typical classroom session look like? Are you prompting? Is it small group work? Is it a worksheet?
Sure. So I wish I had a picture. You have to you have to picture this in your mind a little bit. The classroom I teach in is kind of a seminar room, not really a discussion or a formal classroom per se. So most of the time in class, it's almost a rectangular room with the tables built into a rectangular shape, blah, blah, blah. But off of one corner, we have this round kind of turret with all windows looking out over campus, and there are chairs in it. And we kind of call that the Jedi Council room. So on days we do lit discussions, we purposely move into the Jedi Council room and sit there in a circle, which I think is important. Typically, I will have given them, I probably overwrite my lit discussions. If you look at them, there'll be like 30 questions, which there's no way you're getting through those in a class. I'll give them like 7 beforehand. Usually my first 7, which are a little bit more backgroundy, or maybe do some electron counting kind of things. We'll talk through those, in particular, any ones that they might have any issues with, like this ethylene one we just did on Monday. We talked about TP for a little bit and how to count it. Then I will hand them questions and kind of like, all right, let's go to this question. Let's talk. And they're hesitant the first time. I will let there be awkward silence, and then I'll start calling on people like, so what do you think about this? I don't want to be lecturing this time. So going into the circle and being part of the circle, I think kind of breaks that, oh, he's in charge kind of mode. And, just try to tell them like, we're in the council room. This, someone almost always starts with, well, this might be a dumb answer, in which I say, no, stop. It's not, let's hear it. Just throw it against the wall. Let's see what sticks. Just trying to make it as safe a space as possible for them to just throw out their ideas, and we'll reshape when necessary, or talk a little bit more. So, the first one is a little rough, but I think having the guided reading helps them. From my conversations with them, they were like scared the first time, but they're like, okay, I can read these things. So as we go through the semester, I say less, which is good. And they're driving things more.
Okay. Susanna had a question. Do students present anything in a formal way on these topics, or is it open discussion? And I think you kind of addressed that, but
I probably touched on that a little bit. Yeah. But it's definitely open discussion.
Okay. Have you ever had them do a formal presentation with respect to some of the literature discussions?
I haven't. I certainly, it's not a bad idea. I think the second you go formal with it, it adds the anxiety level, and I don't know that I want to do that. I think I'd rather them get the experience of, hey, let's just sit around and talk science, crazy as it sounds. So I'm hesitant to do it. Doesn't mean I will never. And, I think if I got the sense that no one was reading stuff before they came to class and not participating in discussions at all, there would be okay, here we go.
Adam, it looked like you had a question.
Well, my question's more of a comment.
Okay.
In the spirit of the Gordon comments.
Yes.
The way I do this in my class, when I do these, has typically been more like 15 or so when I do, and I have it's an intro advanced course, right? It's a junior level course, but it's the first, but it's an advanced course. So it's no one understands my class. I don't even understand my class. But what I do is something called a Harkness diagram. And I just looked on the Viper site and I linked to it twice. So if you search for Harkness diagram, you'll find it. And what I'm much more hands-off, it sounds like, than you are, Chip, which I think makes a lot of sense given our personalities. I actually sit outside of the circle, and I don't have the Jedi Council room, but we just move the chairs into a rectangle, I have one person scribe sort of a notes, so no one has to take notes, and I have one person scribe the Harkness diagram, which is a way to track how the conversation flows. And I don't require that all students participate all weeks, and I don't require that, you have to talk a certain number of times, but they look at the nodes coming out of them and like, oh, I only spoke to this one person and I never responded to someone else. So it's a good way to sort of visually track a discussion that I have enjoyed. And then the scribes just post that to our course management thing, and they can all see it. So I have found that to work pretty well in a class of 15. So that was the comment. My question is, I'm in the process over the next several years of taking my course and turning it from a junior senior level course into a sophomore junior level course, and it will be a true intro course. And I'm a little scared to let go of the content. I'm scared to let go of the content with my juniors, like the Monsanto process. I have a discussion, an LO on the site, which is where they discover the mechanism of the carbonyl insertion reaction, and that's a worksheet. And once I let go of it, instead of lecturing it and actually let them discover it, was like, oh, of course they learn it better by actually going through the worksheet. So, but can sophomores do it? Like, do you do this in your intro course?
So my intro course is, this weird hybrid monster of sophomore level with first years through seniors in it. And a lot of them are engineers, and it tends to be around 25. So I've never felt like it's a space I want to go down, just because, especially, probably close to 2/3 of the students are engineers that are taking it as an elective. So I just don't know that I want to see the experiment of will they read something or not. Yeah, I think it would depend a lot on the population. If it were all majors, I'd be totally down with doing, and I think it'd be great for them, but I just see that being a disaster in my course and population. Maybe I'm wrong, probably am, but
you could do one or two, right, in the second half of the semester. And I mean,
maybe, yeah. One of these days I will do that experiment.
Yeah.
Chris?
Yeah, I was curious about, so this is, you're saying senior level, but where in the curriculum have they either had to do literature searches, read papers? Have they learned some of those skills before this course? Or how's the curriculum kind of structured?
Sure. So this senior class will be sort of the last one that I would say this of. So the simple answer to your question is, it depends. Right. So if they took my inorganic 1 lab, which not every student was required to do, part of that lab is a lot of SciFinder searching and all that, so they'd have some skills there. I have an analytical colleague that has them do a little bit of paper reading, and that's about it. So on some levels they have very limited, unless they've been doing it as part of their research, which probably about half the students I have in my class would have been, half not. So that's one reason I do this, because I think it's important that they get that at some point. We have just changed our curriculum, so we're introducing a cure kind of junior level. So that's starting this coming spring. So I envision next fall it will be very different from what my students have experience-wise with that.
Another question from the chat. What about these lit discussions do students find the most useful and the least appealing or useful? So both sides of the coin there.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think they whether or not they know it or not, I think they find most useful that they can actually read the literature. They might not realize that's the answer, but that they can do it. What they might find most useful probably varies lit discussion to lit discussion, but I do think it reinforces things. In particular, one that I'd say I've noticed over the years is just, back bonding and carbonyls. I would say before I had these two lit discussions in place, pretty much every year it would be, oh, an increase in back bonding means you get a stronger CO bond, or half the students would say one way, half would go the other way. And I think the fact that we really harp on it and they can see the numbers in this series of compounds really helps them get that down. So I think that's kind of the biggest thing they get out of it. What do they find least appealing, useful? My guess would be, I haven't really polled them on it, and I can't say I've seen a lot of useful comments in student evaluations. Probably some redundancy. I probably overkill them with counting and doing some group theory things that ultimately, to understanding the paper, may not be that necessary, but I think it's good to rehash. So those would be my guesses. Maybe I'll ask them next week when we do our next lit discussion what they felt.
If I can add, Chip, I think that in my past experience, it was that students could interpret something, like actually sit down and look at a table and be like, oh, I actually get this. Because a lot of times our data interpretation comes from the lab, where they have some understanding of what they're trying to do. And here, just being given some data, they're just like, but they get it eventually. And I think that's, for me, that was always very useful for them as chemistry majors going forward. So that's what I always saw as most useful. Whether they think it is not necessarily the same. So
I have a great anecdote. So I used to teach my inorganic course to juniors, and I did an organometallics course to seniors, and I started opening that up to both juniors and seniors and offering it every other year because the enrollments were low. And so one of the first times I taught it to juniors and seniors, the juniors hadn't had inorganic because it was in the fall before they took inorganic. And so I said, look, you're going to learn to read papers and you're going to learn some organometallic chemistry. And then at the end of the semester, one of my students, who turned into one of my research students, she said, I feel like your class, I learned how to read papers and I didn't learn any organometallic chemistry. And then she worked in my lab for a year, and then she went to grad school, and she emailed me from grad school and said, you know what, I did learn some organometallics. She just didn't know it because the hard part was learning to read the papers. But she did get, she's like, oh, I already learned this. Like, it was 2 years ago. I took this class before inorganic, and and so she took the time to actually email me. So Brett, if you're listening, thank you. But she said, I really did learn how to read papers, and I really did learn the material. And if that isn't a statement on why we should all be doing this, I mean, and yet I'm the worst. I really am not good at doing this in my class.
The effort counts.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious then, as you're bringing up these different points, this class senior level, what's kind of the makeup of these students? Like, where are they all majors, and then are they all going on to graduate school or different places? Like, what's that type of demographic?
So they're all majors. I've never had a non-major in there. But as I mentioned, that some of them are biochemistry majors that didn't take inorganic 1. So that's a little different. Some of them are have been, well, if I think about my course this fall, like one of them is one of my research students who's been working with me since after her sophomore year. And then I have a student who's going to optometry school, is a major, but is a AB major, not a BS major. So she's taken a little less chemistry courses than a BS chemistry major has. So it tends to be a little bit of a range for sure. But I think all the students are equally participating and working towards it, even though they know they have, different goals later on.
Cool. Thanks.
Any other comments or questions for Chip?
Or in general.
Or in general. You just need to unload. We could stop recording.
SLiTHER After Dark.
Well, if not, thank you very much, Chip, for the presentation. Adam says it asks if he should mention
No,
how
he
great his
shouldn't.
battle is. No, you shouldn't. So thank you, Chip, for the presentation. Again, this will be posted up on YouTube, and there'll be an LO posted on the Viper site with the LOs that Chip has included in there. With that, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good day. All right, bye.